We look at the Giza Plateau and we look at the pyramids and we think, wow, that's incredible. Look at the achievements. But what about under the ground? There was a whole network of rooms and cavities underneath the Sphinx. The entire area of Giza may have an entire subterranean area underneath it.
You realize the implications of what you're saying. You're saying that NASA figured out that we're actually living in these sort of civilizational cycles, and they're hiding it.
And in order to cover it up, they blocked all knowledge of the binary star companion so that that whole cycle would not be understood.
You're of the opinion that this dead star is headed towards the sun now.
Yes.
When do you think these underground cities were built?
That's the ultimate question. Nobody knows. And it was sealed and buried and concealed by the flood.
I think this is what we call Atlantis.
I would say that it's what we're looking for the lost civilizations.
Matt LaCroix, I could not be more excited to have you, man. This has been a long time coming. I've seen a couple of your episodes with Julian Dory, and it's really serendipitous because I'm in LA. I interviewed Graham Hancock 2 days ago, and I feel like he takes things to a certain point. He's done an amazing job along with Randall Carlson and many others as far as, I think, really proving out the Younger Dryas impact theory, this idea that at the latter end of the last ice age, there was maybe this comet airburst from the Taurid meteor stream that wiped out some proto-civilization, some civilization that existed prior to ours. He speculates as to what that civilization is. He talks about the Atlantean myth, which comes from Plato. But I think where Graham falls short, and he'll admit he falls short at times, is actually proving out that that proto-civilization definitely existed, characterizing them. Who were they? What did they, do? What were their mythologies? How did they live? What technology did they have? And I think you're sort of taking things to a whole other level with your work as far as, really discovering what this civilization was all about and, what they were building. And you're figuring out conflations that were made between this civilization and other civilizations that are much less old. And so I couldn't be more excited to have you, man.
Thanks, Jesse. It's great to be here. I'm looking forward to this conversation, definitely.
Yeah, it's going to be a blast. So, okay, I want to start in the most basic possible kind of starting point.
Sure.
And so how did you get into the idea that there's sort of this big civilizational cover-up? There's, the civilization before ours, it got wiped out. How did you get into that idea to begin with?
Well, I've had this natural curiosity for a lot of my life, seeing early movies that showed lost civilization type of concepts and advanced things that were long ago, long before we're told. And I have to give a lot of credit to Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson. They definitely spearheaded me a lot of early on in my journey of understanding this and kind of doing that wow factor of like, wait a minute. So things perhaps are very different than we're taught in school, and in which archaeology positions themselves on giving an idea of what our history looked like in what's called a gradualism kind of way, right? Where we were primitive once, long ago, hunter-gatherers, and then our current era of going from Iron Age, Bronze Age, up until our current age is this linear growth. And that's all we've been taught. But really, to me, if you look at all the evidence that's been mounting, right? I just got back from Turkey with Dr. Robert Schoch, who is one of the main players that was brought over by John Anthony West to go investigate the Sphinx enclosure to see if it is truly wind erosion, as archaeologists and geologists had postulated, or whether or not it's really water erosion, because that really matters because it takes that whole dating of the idea of the Sphinx being created at a much, much earlier time. Yeah, and that's where a lot of this blossomed, is those kinds of things.
Let's set this up for the audience real quick. So if you were to talk to like the Egypt Ministry of Culture, they would tell you, that the Sphinx was built in, modern Egyptian kingdom.
Yeah.
And in fact, what people like Robert Schoch and John Anthony West have found is that there's water erosion damage on the nose of the limestone of the Sphinx, and that this would show that there's some sort of maybe tropical climate that it originally existed in. And people like Graham Hancock have followed up on this to say that maybe actually it was a lion to begin with fully.
Exactly.
And so this lined up with the Leo, which was the constellation. That was the vernal equinox shift occurring in 10,500 BC. around the time maybe it was actually built, and that much later it was sort of retrofitted with this pharaonic headdress.
Exactly. And that's actually one of the themes that we're going to be discussing throughout this talk is the idea that you have a civilization emerge at a later time period. We'll start by saying the dynastic Egyptians, okay? Khufu and Ramses and all these others that actually found and emerged out of what was a much earlier civilization that had been there. And what they did, and it looks like increasing evidence is showing that, is that they adopted those sites, but not only adopted them, they tried to claim them, that they were basically the ones who built them and recarved certain things. Like what you said, as I believe 100%, that if you look at the way that the body of the Sphinx is versus the head's too small. Because the head was never supposed to be that size. It was built in proportion with the body. And like you said, I believe as well, it was a lion, and that it was basically what we think of as a guardian. The ancients believed that if you created something to be certain types of spirit animals, like lions and eagles and different things, they embodied this protective aspect. And so they would create, and we're going to get into that, a lot of stuff with Turkey, is that they created these artifacts and these symbols and murals and statues that shows these protector creatures that were basically part of guarding things like ancient libraries and underground areas. And that's what I believe the Sphinx is essentially it's guarding an entire subterranean area underneath it. That we look at the Giza Plateau and we look at the pyramids and we think, wow, that's incredible. Look at the achievements. But what about under the ground?
Why do you think there's something under the ground there?
Well, again, I was just with Dr. Robert Schoch in Turkey, and we were talking extensively over dinner about how he was part in spearheading these sonar, these readings, basically ground penetrating type of radar sonar under the ground, looking at voids underneath the areas and seeing these massive, massive voids with actual objects present. So, for instance,
what objects are
well,
present?
you can have cavities that water can naturally erode, right? Something where it's like a cave underneath. Well, no, because they're clearly been cut with tools or whatever they use to cut them. And there are, again, like I said, there are objects down there that have like blocks or things like that are not natural. And so we know,
and we've picked that up with sonar. Has anybody gone down there and tried to verify?
Well, this is the story, and I'll tell this story is that in the 90s, when they found these massive voids, and it's not just under the Sphinx, it's under the Great Pyramids as well. They all connect with these like subterranean underworld type of areas. They found that there was a whole network of rooms and cavities underneath the Sphinx as the first area that then led to literally the entire area of Giza may have an entire subterranean area underneath it. Now, we're told by things like Edgar Cayce and others that there was like an ancient library that was supposed to be underneath the Great Sphinx that had the records of ancient times and all these secrets and things like that. And they called it it was called the Halls of Amenti that led to this ancient library. Now, when they found these voids, we know that there are 4 entrances, underneath the Sphinx. There's one under the left paw. There's one on the top of the head, and you can actually, if you go like online right now and look up tunnel on top of the head, you can see it. It's capped off on top. Mm-hmm. There's one on the back side, and then there's another one on one of the other sides of the Sphinx. So there's 3 to 4 entrances that are known about.
So is the Sphinx hollow?
No, it's made out of actually the bedrock. So it was an entire section of bedrock that they took all the sides away.
But when you say an entrance coming from the head, what are you entering?
It's carved down into this bedrock body.
Okay.
The entire Sphinx is not made out of stones put together. It's made out of a bedrock foundation body. Okay. So it's just cut out of the bedrock. And so they have tunnels. Especially Robert Schoch determined that the one under the paw, I think it might actually be the right paw.
So the Sphinx is like a gate.
It's like a gateway. It's like a guardian that's guarding these entrances that go into like ancient libraries.
Wow.
Okay, now
why can't we go down?
Well,
there?
This is what happened when they determined in the 90s, and they had these basically types of ground penetrating radar, like different types of ways that they were determining it to find the voids. They published them and they kind of went viral, and everyone's like, oh my God, what's down there? And the Egyptian authorities came through and they boarded up the front of the pause with boards, literal boards, and blocked it off. And then what they did is very clever. They ended up drilling down to prove to the public that there was no voids, but they purposely went where there wasn't entrances, just drilling down into rock and say, look, there's nothing here. And it was very, very misleading and clever, so that people are like, oh, shoot, so there weren't really voids down there. It was just like an opening and that's from rainwater or something, and they tricked people.
Do you think they're simultaneously going down there and excavating?
Question is, have they ever been down? There's really no answer to that to know. But if you knew about that and you deliberately didn't go down and then you literally boarded up, the whole front of the Sphinx is now boarded up. That would, to me, be something where you're trying to kind of silence
Who took
that
the
whole
first
story.
sonar readings?
It was Robert Jacques was part of a team, a whole team that was basically looking down and taking this type of ground penetrating radar
Is he not campaigning and outraged and saying we should be going down there? Or what?
There are steps that need to happen. There are many, many, many millions of dollars that need to be obtained, and then universities that have to be brought into this. It's something that I know that he would potentially be interested in. We would like other groups and others that are interested to come together to try to bring this back again and reignite this underground exploration of the subterranean areas of Giza. And I think it will happen in the future. And I get maybe this types of conversations are what's needed to get that started again.
Do you have a hypothesis as to what might be down there?
I think there are entire chambers, and I think there probably is a library. Now, if that library was made out of paper, it wouldn't exist anymore, because paper only survives for 500 to 1,000 years, which would mean that it had to be something like tablets with like type of cuneiform or hieroglyphics carved into it. Whatever it is would have to be able to survive literally 10,000 years underground, which is not, again, paper would never be able to, so you'd have to have other means.
So if the Sphinx were actually built around 10,500 BC, what sort of writing would you expect to find down in these tunnels?
Well, that's the question, is whether or not hieroglyphics like we see in any dynastic Egyptians was even the type of language that they used. And that's going to come up again when we talk about cuneiform. It's a writing style that we see throughout Mesopotamia. Now, to be very clear, if you were not to carve some kind of writing into stone or clay, there would simply be no method that we know exists for how to leave a message. Now, I'll give one caveat to that. There could be some type of technology that they incorporated into stone that could have a way to record information that we don't understand yet. Because I say that because there was a very specific reason that these civilizations would get certain kinds of stone. So they would not be like, oh, hey, look, there's some bedrock to our right or left. Let's go cut those blocks out of that. They didn't do that. That didn't seem to matter to them. In fact, the distance that they were willing to go to obtain certain stone was even irrelevant to them. But to give you an example, all the pink granite we find throughout the Giza Plateau came from 500 miles away to the south in the Aswan Quarry. That was your only source of this type of pink granite, which of course is extremely high in silica quartz, which is the same substance that we use for watches. So is there something there with keep recording messages in that we don't understand? I want to throw that out as a possibility so that I don't say that the only form of writing would be like cuneiform or hieroglyphics in stone.
Do you think that the Great Pyramids of Giza were also built around that period, much earlier than?
Well, and this is an interesting dilemma, is that, first of all, we know they're at least 10,500 BC. And that's the first thing to point out, because, number one, that's when we have these alignments with different star constellations. Okay, there's something called the King and Queen's Chamber that face different constellations, right? The Queen's Chamber faces Sirius. It's like a feminine energy. And the King's Chamber faces Orion. The problem is based on what's called the precession of the equinoxes, which is how the Earth wobbles and looks at different ages and constellations. That could not have happened in modern history all the way until you get back to 10,500 BC. The problem is that was an extremely volatile time for Earth's history. That was during this period of the older and then the younger Dryas, which is basically when our Earth went from the Pleistocene epoch to the Holocene epoch, and we went through these catastrophic periods. Now, we can get into what caused them, because I personally don't believe it was an impact. And we can get into some of the implications of how there's correlations between both and have similar evidence for what, they could lead to that. But the problem is, if you have extremely volatile periods on the Earth, it wouldn't make sense to me to be able to build these massive structures during that. Now, John Anthony West, and I know that Robert Schoch and him had a lot of conversations around this. John Anthony West believed that it was a previous age in which the Sphinx was built, and I do as well.
Well, the thing that never made sense to me about some of the extrapolations of the kind of Hamlet's Mill thesis, this idea that we would build, architecture specifically around the Great Precession, the vernal equinoxes, that it's 26,000 year cycles.
Yeah, that's the great year. That's what's called the great year.
Right. So like the idea that in 10,500 BC, that civilization that's building a specific megalithic architecture would have the cosmic understanding of 26,000 years prior. Like they really understand these sort of macro cycles when it comes to cosmology and astronomy.
Yeah,
that seems hard for even me to believe, and so that makes me think maybe it is old. Look, I believe that simultaneous to what I'm saying, to play devil's advocate, I do think ancient civilizations had precocious understanding of the stars, and they had, like you could look at Sumerian architecture where, it feels like they understand this heliocentric universe, and they have like all the, planets in their rough alignment. Having said that, 26,000 year cycles, that feels really crazy. But what do you think?
I think we shouldn't underestimate the knowledge that these lost civilizations, and I say that's in quotes, lost civilizations understood, and that we were completely reset, just like Graham Hancock says, right? A species with amnesia. We don't remember who we are. We don't remember what we once were and what we once understood. And I think that these monuments that basically are evidence, I think, left behind to be the test of time, built out of the hardest stones in the world, would be the perfect way to be able to have their memory and their knowledge be preserved so that someday in the future, humanity could finally find their way back. And I say find their way back because I believe that they had sophistication and knowledge that we simply don't have even now.
Well, have you ever watched the movie Stargate?
In fact, when you asked me that question of how I got into this, I would say Stargate was the first movie that truly awakened me and encapsulated me at a young age in wide wonder to be like, wait a minute, there's something else going on here. These events that occurred during the Younger Dryas with what I believe was the last CME event was 12,500 years ago. So we're literally exactly in that time period. And we're seeing these extreme warming and these plasma-like type of weakening of the magnetosphere type of events, just like we saw
This is not at all scientific. This is purely my own, it's like asserting free will or something like that. Something I sort of refuse to go outside the bounds of. So I'll admit this is kind of dogmatic, but I just don't believe that every 12,500 years there's just a hard reset button. We've got to have some sort of agency around this.
I can go into that if you want to.
I would love
I
to
actually
get
have
into
some
that.
evidence you probably haven't heard of yet that might blow your mind on that.
Please.
Okay, so again, like I mentioned, there's always indications that these things are going to happen way ahead of time, right? CO2 spikes, temperatures spike.
Yeah.
You get these geomagnetic events with these aurora borealis, right? You see them. Now, the next level, and if we start seeing this, we need to worry, is plasma discharge designs in the sky, which is what I was just talking about with what was Dr. Robert Schoch's theory on a Rongo text and even potentially the Nazca lines, is that they're actually these geometric formations that occur in the sky based on massive amounts of what are called charged solar particles. that come into our upper atmosphere, and they create these very interesting electromagnetic designs. Okay? Now, I want to discuss something that might be new to you. And if you're interested in seeing an image of what I'm talking about, it's on the bottom of my main page of my website, thestageoftime.com. Okay. In 1987, there was an encyclopedia that came out called the New Science Encyclopedia. Okay? And this is back before computers were really up and running, or we didn't have that capability. So information you really got through like encyclopedias, right? That's where things came through. Well, it had this unbelievable image on, I think, page 2,488, if something like that, where it showed, and it didn't say really much about it. All it said is the following image is a diagram based on Pioneer 10 and 11 probes. Okay. And then it said like, oh, we sent out a plaque on it, blah, blah, blah. Well, what it shows, and I can get into what Pioneer 10 and 11 found because it directly relates to this entire great year, this entire cycle, and how it might help you understand why this stuff keeps happening at 12,000 to 12,500 years every time.
Interesting.
Okay?
Yeah.
Is that what they found, and this may be new to people and it may blow a lot of minds, and I would again encourage people to go to my website and see that image, by the way, which is very hard to find online. Seemed like it was scrubbed.
Where was it
across a lot of things. I ended up digging in and finding a PDF version of it that was like somebody might have emailed it to me or whatever, where I got a high definition version of it, and then I scanned it and then I uploaded it, so I'm like, oh, we need to preserve this, right?
Where was it taken exactly?
Well, okay, I'll go back and tell you how this started.
Yeah.
In the 1970s, there were the first probes ever in history that were sent out in deep space. Mm-hmm. It's funny to me how people have only heard of Voyager, right? They're like, oh, Voyager. No, Pioneer. Yeah. Pioneer came before Voyager, hence the name Pioneer. It was the first deep space probes we ever sent out into interstellar space, okay? If you think about neighborhoods of space, the area between us and the sun is this actually quite small little neighborhood. Our outer solar system is this whole other vast area beyond the sun that then basically is bordered by what's called the Kuiper Belt, right? Mm-hmm. I'm sure Graham talked about that being impacted by the torrid meteor shower, right?
Yep.
Torrid meteor shower comes through, and one of the theories is it can bump around some of these Kuiper Belt objects, which are giant asteroids and comets in the outer part of our solar system that basically dwarf our asteroid belt around Mars that is like nothing compared to this, okay? Well, Pioneer 10 gets sent out one direction and Pioneer 11 gets sent out another direction. And they were basically sent out to study gravitational protrusions on the outer planets of Uranus and Neptune. They wanted to understand, wait, what the heck? Why are these giant gas planets tilted on their axis? And then as you get closer to the inner solar system, and I'm not an astrophysicist, but I can fill in some blanks here. Why they would be tilted on their axis, something gravitationally is affecting them, right? Is it our sun? Wait, it can't be our sun. How can they be tilted like that? And in fact, our entire solar system is tilted slightly on an axis. So what happened is they send out the probes in the during the 1970s. Both of them, they send them in completely different directions. Remember, space is 3D, so it's not like a linear paper. Right? It's got mass, it's got everything. So you have to go different directions to try to understand how to create like a model, right? Well, in the early 1980s, Pioneer 10 and 11 made history because they were the first probes to leave our inner solar system. Okay, so they get out past the gravitational influences of the sun, and they start passing beyond the Kuiper Belt. And when they do that, boy, did they find something. Now, I'm not surprised you haven't heard of it. Actually, very few have.
What did they find?
Well, the thing is funny about it is that if you go and look up Pioneer 10 and 11, you're not going to find very much information. And I don't want to necessarily just spend a lot of time going down a conspiracy road here, but I will tell you that it seems apparent that the internet was scrubbed of information regarding Pioneer 10 and 11.
What evidence do you have?
Well, there was an astronomer out of NASA,
Yeah.
Actually out of named Thomas, two astronomers, one named Thomas Van Flandern and the other named Robert Harrington. Robert Harrington was a very, very important astronomer who worked for the Navy. Sorry, not NASA, for the Navy. He was a chief astronomer for the Navy. Okay. Well, he's studying the outer solar system. He gets a call one day from Thomas Van Flandern. Thomas Van Flandern is an astronomer as well, who's actually a very interesting man. I wish he got more attention. Very smart, used to talk about even things like ancient history being different than we're told and things like that.
Cool.
Very smart guy. Yeah. He calls up Robert Harrington. He's like, hey, Robert, you got to check out this data from Pioneer 10, right? There's something going on in the outer solar system. And Robert Harrington's like, okay, I'll look into it. And they look into this new data that's coming back from Pioneer 10, and their minds were blown, okay? What Pioneer 10 found, and 11, was not only a planet, okay? Now, I don't want this to be confused with things like Zecharia Sitchin's idea of Nibiru. Yeah. That was actually a whole nother story in itself of something I think was maybe even created to mislead this whole thing. Okay, there's no planet that comes through our inner solar system that would destroy everything. No. But what they did find is a large planet beyond the Kuiper Belt. Okay, part of what is called the outer solar system. Not something that has a lot of information. In fact, the Kuiper Belt wasn't found until the early 1990s. It's relatively new that we even knew that, again, based on it's a lot of the data coming back from the Pioneer probes, which started to leave that area in the early 80s and through that period. Now, there in the 90s, there was an announcement by NASA, and I do believe this was a real announcement, where they did announce this planet, and they called it Planet 9 or Planet 10 based on before Pluto got demoted. And they actually, and and anybody listening to this might remember that. It was actually pretty widespread on the news. They're like, oh, there's this large planet beyond our sun that is very mysterious. It seems to have a mass based on gravitational influences of 4 to 5 times the size of Earth. Massive. Huge planet, okay? Very weird and mysterious.
Wait, where is it positionally? It's beyond Pluto?
Yes, way beyond Pluto.
Okay.
It's way beyond our inner solar system, and it's not part of the rotation around the sun at all. Wow. It's very, very mysterious, okay?
So what sort of gravitational pull is it following?
Well, wait till you find out. Oh. This is where it gets wild.
It's the same thing causing the wobble.
This is where it gets wild. In the same analysis, and remember, Pioneer data was coming in increments over time. Right? Yeah. As you're going further out, you get more data. So it's not like you know everything right away. It's like you're figuring things out. So the first thing they found was this planet, and they initially announced it. Okay, and everyone's like, "Oh, whoa! How could that be possible?" Well, the interesting thing was that even the Kuiper Belt, a lot of the objects in the Kuiper Belt were being warped. The way that they rotate, their mass was being warped by something else. And some postulated that this planet was enough to even impact and affect some of these Kuiper Belt objects. But there's more, though. The planet seem to be revolving around something. Okay? And again, I very much encourage people to go and see this diagram so they don't think I'm full of crap in what I'm saying right now. Because, again, this 1987 encyclopedia showed the entire diagram. But the weird thing was, it was the only place that it ever existed ever again. All the data from Pioneer was essentially scrubbed after.
What was it orbiting around?
Well, when scientists have studied the known universe, okay, I'll say that because we only have a limited view of what we can see with distant stars. But when they've studied other stars like Sirius and other ones, Canis Major, they find out that 80% of all known stars are binary or trinary, meaning that having a single star, our sun, is actually far more rare. You would have an 80% chance that wouldn't be the case.
Are you saying we are in a binary solar system? There's another star that we're not aware of?
Well,
another sun?
But the thing is that when Pioneer 10 and 11 got far enough out beyond this planet that they detected, and you can't see it, it's just based on its gravitational influences. Again, you can't see like, oh, there's a bright planet flying by. It doesn't work that way. Planets, if planets are not illuminated by some kind of an object, they're black.
Yep.
It's just a space is black and you don't even know, except the influence it has.
Wouldn't James Webb pick it up?
Well, again, the space is infinitely difficult to pin down a very specific part. And I can get into all the Caltech studies after that support this. Okay. So this is not just one area.
Okay.
Caltech has since jumped on top of this. You can go on Caltech's website and read all about how this planet is. One of the quotes
the name of the planet?
They don't have a name. They call it Planet 10. Originally, now Planet 9, based on the demotion of Pluto. Okay. Caltech, actually, one of the astronomers there was basically said that he believes there's a 99% chance that it exists based on its effects on the Kuiper Belt and other gravitational effects.
And it's 4 to 5 times larger than the Earth.
Okay, so NASA announces that.
Yeah.
Then they go completely quiet. They never announce anything else ever again from Pioneer 10. In fact, all data on Pioneer 10 and 11 past the Kuiper Belt beyond this Robert Harrington's work and Thomas Van Flandern and 1987 Science and Invention Encyclopedia became the only sources. It was very bizarre. If you have something of that much importance that finds things, to not have any information is, again, screaming towards some kind of a scrubbing of information and hiding.
Why would they cover this up?
Well, because they found something.
What did they find?
Well, according to the diagram in 1987 Encyclopedia, the way that Pioneer 10, and by the way, Pioneer 10 had these spectrometers on board that were literally made to detect objects, which is very interesting because if they're investigating a tilt on Uranus and Neptune, clearly they're looking for something. Okay? Well, they detect a signature that was undeniable because there's specific wording in that diagram, and it says, and I will quote, remember, Pioneer 10 and 11 went completely different directions in our solar system. They say they found equal pull. Doesn't matter where they were in our solar system. As they left, they found equal pull of something massive on our entire solar system. Something gravitationally is so powerful that it was basically influencing our entire solar system, including the sun. Okay? And what they found, they called it a dead star. Okay, now it's not a brown dwarf. It was a dead star that had essentially maybe supernovaed long ago. Whatever happened to it, it no longer had the fusion of a star like our sun, which is why you can't see it. It literally, now there's only two things that can happen to a star when it dies, right? It either explodes or it shrinks down into an unbelievably dense object. But that object still has very, very powerful gravitational influences.
Black hole.
Well, but not everything does that. Not everything just becomes a black hole. In fact, some scientists believe that those are more like at the center of galaxies and different things like that. Instead, this object was identified as a dead star. Not as, and they determined that the distance, ready for this? Based on its influence at the time, and this is like 1984 or 1983 that this data came back because the encyclopedia came out in 87. They determined at that time that it was 50 billion miles from the Pioneer probes. 50 billion miles. Okay? Now, when that occurred, Thomas Van Flandern and Robert Harrington found out about that. Now, all I will say is that they both died of throat cancer. Not within a few years of each other, but they both died of throat cancer. They didn't smoke. It was a very mysterious thing because they were the only two people that were investigating this outer planet and potentially this binary star companion. And then there was a man named Miles Standish, who was the head of, that became a very prominent astronomer in the department. And he was like, everyone's like, wait a minute, what about this planet and all this stuff, right? Miles Standish did a bunch of calculations mathematically and was like, you know what? We made a mistake. Thomas Van Flandern made a mistake. Robert Harrington made a mistake. Turns out all the data is wrong, and there's no planet that's out there. Boom. The thing just disappeared. and it like went completely silent. Everyone's like, okay, never mind.
What's the motive to cover this up?
Because I believe it's the entire reason why the Great Year exists and why we have resets of civilizations and why we have entire cycles of catastrophes and which is based, I believe, on what are known as the Yuga cycles out of India. So the Yuga cycles track the cycles of basically civilization rising and falling based on these ages during the Great Year. So you go from, you rise up to a golden age, you get wiped out, you fall back, and then you have to start up again from like an iron and bronze age, and then a silver age, and then a gold age, and then it resets itself. Well, what could possibly exist to keep a consistency of these cycles other than this? Now, think about this for a minute. If anyone's ever seen it, there's a documentary I highly recommend called The Great Year. Amazing. You can go actually watch it on YouTube. Amazing documentary. Has a great narrator who just passed away recently. Very well known. I can't remember his name off my head. But in that documentary, I believe they got one thing really, really wrong, but they got everything else right. They postulated that the Great Year was based on a dance of our binary companion, but they thought it was Sirius. Now, that makes no sense to me at all because, first of all, Sirius is so far away. It makes 50 billion miles of this binary look like it's in our backyard. So that makes zero sense to me that that's related to the Great Year and the dance of our sun. So I want to just point that out. However, what does make sense is that this dead star having this massive dance called perihelion and aphelion. Perihelion is when something comes, and aphelion is when it's leaving. Well, it turns out that in the Great Year documentary, ancient civilizations believed that entire dance was based on, they called it our black sun. They called it, you ever heard of black holes, black sun, well, David Bowie, right?
Black sun's also kind of this age-old occult symbol.
Well, that turns out there's some truth in this, that there was knowledge of a dark star.
A partner star to our own sun? Some say the binary model confirms all of our celestial observations without the need for excessive torque or epicycle type explanations. While the concept of a second sun challenges our present understanding of the solar system, it is hardly a new idea.
There's one sun which is part of the planetary system, and there's one sun outside the solar system. And this allows Mithras to both be the sun and also seem to be operating for the sun or on behalf of the sun.
The ancients had some knowledge on it. There's different areas. Even there's a whole bunch of areas that would be a whole part of the show. But I just want to say, and not getting that, but just say that basically that there seems to be a dance between this dead binary star with our sun, and every time that dance is based on a approximately 25,000 year full cycle.